Thank you. Thank you for the welcome and the introduction, Monica, also for initiating and organizing this event together with Jorges, Fernando, everyone else at the Angewandte. And thank you for all those who joined the Imagining Organization, the organizational art workshop that we gave that I gave this afternoon, or well, that we did all together. With some great outcomes. I would actually love to debate these outcomes, but that's not what this lecture is for. And to those participants of this afternoon, a few parts of the things I will say now overlap mildly, but please be patient with me. The title of my talk is Imagining Organization, and this relates to what Monica already mentioned, the practice that I term organizational art, the creation of artworks in the form of alternative organizations that hopefully are capable to provoke a way that we can confront rising authoritarianism, global precarity, climate catastrophe. But before going into examples of such organizational artwork, I just wanted to take a moment to maybe say something about where I come from as an artist. Because I realized lately that when I talk about my work, I talk about what I do now, and especially thinking back of my time as a student or first years of artistic practice. Of course, the conditions are so different. There's a trajectory that leads from one thing to another. So, to say something about myself, I would say I come from a background that I would describe as a form of violent education, and this very much informed my interest in institutions and the way that institutions can replicate certain oppressive mechanisms of power. In my case, it led me to be a very early high school dropout, to do a lot of factory works before I was accepted by exemption by the art school. And once graduated, I went to live in Rotterdam, city in the Netherlands, port city of the Netherlands. I lived in the south part of in the south part of Rotterdam, where in order to secure my living, I was a caretaker for elderly and disabled people by day, and I was an artist at night. It sounds a bit Batmanish, but the lowbrow version of it. I will come back to that in a moment. This time that I came to live in Rotterdam, it was around 2004. It was a few years after, you could very much say, meteoric rise of a far-right politician called Pim Fortuyn. He had was murdered by an animal rights activist in 2001. In 2004, the year I came to live in the city, it was far-right filmmaker and artist Theo van Gogh, who was killed by a religious fundamentalist. And in my city, in Rotterdam, port city, a majority of our citizens have a migrant background, and there was a real palpable tension around the rise of the far-right, these public murders having taken place. And I wanted to address this through my work, which I did mainly at night, on the streets of my city. I made works like these, called Dutch Flags, which was a series of street drawings. So there were drawings made with flags, with Dutch flags, suggesting the kind of ghostly remainders of secretive nationalist gatherings. And it was a way of trying to make visible the ghostly support of the far right. Because in election polls, I don't know if it has been similar here in Austria or the different countries where you're from, in election polls, it never showed that the far right was going to win. You know, they were always polling low until election day, and then suddenly and shock, everyone was shocked. It was somehow, so I was trying to find a visual language that could grasp this ghostly presence of the far-right electorate. Other works I made was the replacement of street signs. I replaced street signs that were originally in Dutch in neighborhoods where the majority language was a different one, in this case the majority language being Arabic. Of course, this addressed was a way to play into dominant language of the far right that always suggests this kind of secret plot for a great replacement. Mass migration will replace our identity, will replace our population. On the other hand, there's another neighborhood this was in The Hague, in the city of The Hague, where there's a majority Chinese Dutch citizens, and they do have Chinese name signs. This would never happen in the case of Arabic, so it was also a way of confronting the very different policy frameworks with which migrant communities in my country were being treated. Other works like these, the placement of car bomb wreckages, well, wreckages that were modeled after images of car bombs. At the time, the Netherlands was participating in the illegal wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I felt there was a continuous discrepancy between us being a country that was supporting this war, but never feeling like we were at war. So there was a kind of a sense of alienation between being a country at war without any resonance from the war back. So I began to reconstruct car bomb wreckages from media images in Iraq and place them at night in the city, trying to give a kind of feedback to this media reality, to give it a material presence in the city. In other works, I flew planes above different city centers that declared two slogans: be free, but as a kind of dictum, as a kind of obligation, be free or else. And it was an attempt to challenge this construction of freedom that is propagated by both neoliberals and the far right alike. And that it's a notion of freedom, a doctrinal notion of freedom that at essence is always about taking the freedom of someone else. It is never an emancipatory freedom, it's a freedom that is actually a threat. It's be free as in assimilate according to whatever this dominant national culture is supposed to be free or else forced deportation, be free or else structural mistreatment by the police, be free or else invasion. This was also still in the aftermath of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The most controversial project by far from this early series of interventionist artworks, you could say, was called the Geert Wilders Works. It's a piece from 2005, which was a series of improvised memorials with depiction of the far-right politician Geert Wilders, that you can see here, of the PVV party, which translates as Freedom Party. It's exactly literally the same name of the FPÖ here in Austria. And the type of white supremacist freedom the white supremacist freedom that Wilders propagated, Wilders that you see on the pictures here, consisted of, actual proposals that this political party have done the last 15 years are, amongst others, that Moroccan Dutch youth that engage in petty crime should be shot through the kneecaps. That there should be a Guantanamo Bay modeled prison in the Netherlands for Dutch people with a migrant background. The banning of the Quran, the closing of mosques, the preemptive bombing of Iran. By now this has almost become a kind of firebrand copy of agendas from Orban's Hungary to the FPÖ here, to the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, but it doesn't make it less shocking and offensive. So, as a result of Wilders, this person threatening Dutch communities of immigrant origins, he himself is being threatened as well. It tends to happen if you make legislative proposal that threaten large parts of your population with deportation, you might get a threat back. And he uses this very effectively in his campaigns. He walks around publicly with a bulletproof vest, trying to present himself as a kind of martyr for democratic freedoms. Like, I am being threatened the way our entire society is threatened. He kind of tries to embody this idea of Dutch national culture. But paradoxically, he's a martyr that never dies. He sacrifices himself, but he never disappears. He keeps on existing. He's a kind of zombie-like political figure, you could say. And that was what I tried to depict through this series of memorial installations that I made anonymously in different locations throughout the Netherlands. This image is actually the entire project is documented by the police. This is a page from the police file that was built as a result of these works emerging in the public space. So media picked up on the works. Wilders reported to the police that he felt threatened by the artworks. The police were not so certain. They made public statements saying, we're not sure. Maybe someone is threatening you, maybe someone is celebrating you. Like maybe these are kind of like a strange, like a religious, fetishistic type of support for your policies. And after about a month of speculation, I announced I was the artist behind the work. I was immediately arrested and jailed. This is a page from the police file. It's part of the documentation of the artwork. And what followed was 3 years of court cases that Wilders waged against me. Now I quickly realized these legal proceedings are very much part of the work. Like the artworks provoked these court cases, and the court is a very theatrical setting. It's a performative arena, a place where very different claims to reality are put into confrontation with one another. And I was not able to, we're not allowed to photograph in the court, so I had to hire another artist, which is also interesting, a court artist, to document the artist in the court. Now this was 2005, so this is like 17 years ago, and this is how I look like in this picture. Like very guilty and very old. But it's also interesting because I realized that's a strange power that court artists have. Like we never know who these people are, really. They're not like publicly known artists. But they are the ones who depict you as a potentially guilty person or a prosecuted person in the larger media. So I suddenly discovered a very strange political power that court artists have. So in this case, the court, this performative arena, was a place where you could say that different claims to truth came into confrontation. Wilders claims this is not an artwork, but a threat to my life. I claimed the artwork is a very real depiction of the emergence of a new far-right culture of martyrdom. The law lays a claim to truth as a supposed neutral arbiter in the process. So this brought me to also announce the works, to send public invitations for the public to join, to hire the court artist. I wrote my own defenses in the form of manifestos that the national Dutch newspaper published. And I won the case against Wilders, but it only turned out to be the beginning of a longer research to deconstruct and challenge the emerging politics and mythologies and symbols of the far right in the Netherlands. In 2010, only a few years after the court case ended, Wilders' Freedom Party actually entered into government. And at that time, their platform was no longer only focused on immigrants and people of Islamic faith. He was more and more concerned with the threat of contemporary artists. Maybe I had a role to play in that process, this I'm not entirely sure. But in his program, the party started to frame artists more and more as a kind of embodiment of a degenerate, multicultural, left-wing culture, very much this kind of reiteration of the entartete Kunst. Now today, many of the far-right parties call it cultural Marxism. Surprisingly though, in the process I found out that the number 2 of the Freedom Party, of Wilders' platform, Fleur Agema had herself been an art student. And not only had she been an art student, we actually attended the same art school at more or less the same period of time. So I went back to the archives of our art school to find out, like, what exactly had Agema done as an artist? What could her art tell me about the role of the rise about her role in the rise of the far right? And in our library, I found Agema's thesis. It's a 366-page document that is called Closed Architecture. And it consists of her graduation project, which is a proposal, a very detailed proposal for an alternative prison model. So, I mean, somewhere also, I often feel, there's this struggle we struggle to imagine alternative futures, and sometimes I feel we also struggle to imagine how bad our situation really is, like how absurd and perverse. That in this case, what does the artist that later joins the far-right party, what is it that she developed as an artist? A prison model. Like, of course, but somehow I couldn't have imagined it if you would have asked me before. So I assembled a team of architects to analyze this prison model, which essentially consists of a four-phased prison model that follows an almost game-like logic in which prisoners have to move from one compound to the next. Here you have a drawing of Agema herself. And the idea is that in her model, prisoners would not be sentenced to a specific period of detention, like you are imprisoned for 2.5 years or whatever, but to a specific level of the prison. So for example, for phase 1, which she calls the bunker, is like this very isolated, super minimalist, very sober, almost kind of cartoonesque image of a prison. This is the 3D model reconstruction that we made. They stay there in maximum isolation, but if the prisoner reaches certain learning objectives, it's unclear what these learning objectives are, but if they reach certain learning objectives, they move forward into the prison or backward into the prison. So essentially, the prisoner is tasked to liberate themselves. Like, depending on your behavior, you might get out faster or never. So, in the process of moving from one phase to another, there are certain incentives. So, if you move forward into the prison, you get more spacious compounds, there are certain consumer products, you might even get a computer, and you get more light. So, for Agema, this is very important that from phase 1 to phase 4 of the prison, it goes from dark to light. So the control of light reflects the phase of your liberation or your going backward. And the fourth phase is literally called the light. So this is Agema's design of the light. This is our digital reconstruction of it. And this is maybe the most interesting part of the prison because we see a kind of upper middle class living facilities, large recreational grounds. There are many shops, services available to the prisoners. Guards have entirely disappeared, so there are only invisible security cameras. Essentially, it's a kind of Truman Show-like logic in which it's no longer really clear if we're still in the prison or if we're outside the prison. And I think that makes really clear the ultimate goal of Agema's design and also that of Wilders' Freedom Party as a whole. It's the aim to transform society itself into a prison, into a perpetual mechanism of control, into what Gilles Deleuze calls, in the length of Foucault's disciplinary society, the society of control. So my work on closed architecture, it translated into architectural models, a book, a full reconstruction of each of the cells of the prison model in a theater context. It was one of the rare projects that became a front page news, and I think it had to do with the fact that the party had just entered into government and no one really knew what to expect. So somehow Agema's model was something that showed from recent history a kind of larger plan or societal model that they were trying to move towards. But it was also in many ways a project that was a wake-up call to me as something that confronted me with the limits of my own artistic practice. Like my public interventions, the work I showed before, the works on the street, or the research into this prison model, it made visible the way that the far right was reorganizing society, but becoming aware of these things doesn't really change them from happening. I tend to call this the WikiLeaks paradox. We can become more aware of systemic injustices in politics, economy, military, industrial complex, but simply knowing about something is not the same as changing it. Like being aware or becoming aware is not unimportant, but becoming awareness in and of itself is not a force of political change, it's not a force of transformation per se. So I began to think of my work differently. Instead of opposing the far right's turn in our parliaments, in our courts, was the point maybe not to transform these courts, to transform the parliaments in the first place? And that's what I try to address in the title of this talk, Imagining Organization. Instead of merely which is important, to research, to critique, to confront systems of injustice or system of oppression, but simultaneously to try to build propositions of what alternative systems of societal organization could or should be. This, by the way, is the theater reconstruction of the prison model of Agema. So the cubes you see on the floor are the exact measurements of the 4 cells in each of the 4 stages of the prison. And then on the top you see the kind of floor of the cell turned upwards, and very slowly the light passes from morning to night. So it shows also how this control over light in each of the different phases of the prison model. And so this is the point where I would say that my artistic practice took an organizational turn, to not only critique existing organizational forms, but to conceptualize alternative infrastructures and institutions. That is what I mean when I talk about organizational art. And I want to give a first example of this organizational art practice in a work that very much came in response to the research on Agema's prison model, which is called the New World Summit. New World Summit is an artistic and political organization I founded in 2012. It consists of a larger team of architects, designers, political scientists, progressive diplomats, lawyers, with whom we develop alternative parliaments, like the one you see here in the Sophiensäle in Berlin, 2012, first parliament we ever created. Alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. This project was made very strongly in response to the ongoing war on terror, the politics of blacklisting in particular, the way that the war on terror used blacklists to be able to retrieve passports, freeze bank accounts, impose travel ban on organizations that it claims form a threat to democracy. And that fits, of course, the larger master narrative of the war on terror, that it's a fight, it's a war of us versus them. Us, the so-called free, enlightened, democratic West, them, the barbaric, fundamentalist Islamic East. That's the narrative, that's the master propaganda narrative of the war on terror. Of course, researching the blacklists and all of the flags that you see in this structure belong to organizations that today are placed on designated lists of terrorist organizations, reveals many organizations with long histories stemming from anti-colonial and liberational struggle, not organizations that by definition hate democracy in this cliché, the cliché narrative of the war on terror. In many cases, organizations that, exactly because of this liberational anti-colonial history, make extremely fundamental demands for wealth redistribution, colonial reparation, demands that in a way are too democratic for our current system of democracy, of liberal democracy or capitalist democracy, to bear. So you could say the problem is not that they necessarily hate democracy, but that they are more democratic than democracy itself. And that makes them a threat. So what we tried to do was to create these parliaments to assemble these organizations excluded from current democratic spaces of representation, and to try to narrate these alternative world histories from the perspective of the resistance, but also to create spaces, these spaces of assembly here, one of our alternative parliaments in Brussels, spaces of assembly where we could begin to recompose who or what exactly is this us in the us versus them dichotomy. Is it possible that for us, citizens of, politicized citizens of society who have protested the war, that we have much more in common with those who are prosecuted in the war than with the criminal states that claim to act in our name? States that enact in forms of structural state terrorism, with hundreds of thousands of deaths as a result in the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. So the spaces of the parliament became a place to recompose in organizationally and physically, and in terms of narrative, the common stories that we tell, to recompose us. And of course, let's say the artistic and architectural and design components here are very important, because we took this also as a chance not only to make a political statement against the war on terror and its illegal paralegal practices, but also to explore the way that the structure of the parliament, the way that morphology, that form, prefigures the kind of collectivity that we can achieve in a gathering. So, how can I say this best? We try to explore the relationship between form and political assembly. So, for example, we tested different geometrical formations: circle, triangle, oval. How these forms influence our experience of political assembly. Like most parliaments tend to be half circles or three-quarter circles that relate directly to a main speaker, a main representative, a figure of power or authority. But in our parliament, at one moment a representative might stand on the other side of the room and stand up and speak towards you. Performatively, that seems like someone is trying to convince you. That's what the spatial performative configuration at that moment does. But another moment, the speaker might be sitting next to you and stand and speak forward. And at that moment, performatively, it seems someone is speaking on behalf of you. So what I'm trying to say is that the way this visual and performative structure of a parliament really strongly influences how we relate to one another and to a political message, to a narrative that is being told to us. So we try to challenge that on a variety of ways, to erase the use of chairs, for example. We became more and more fanatically opposed to chairs, because chairs are these very, very tragic forms, these individualizing forms. It's always like a chair can only do two things: it's empty or it's full. And when you come into a room and there are empty chairs, somehow your eyes are always pulled towards the empty chairs, not to the full chairs. So it's also a strange denial of those who are there, and instead you're busy with who isn't there. We became very interested in the history of the bench and the history of the bench in utopian political architectures and structures. And the bench is very curious, because one person on the bench is a full bench, but 10 people on the bench is also a full bench. And the bench is a space that allows for democratic negotiation. You can always make more space on a bench if you are willing to make that space for another. So even before a political gathering takes place, there's already a political process of how you share space, who you are willing to share space with. So the space itself, the structure of assembly, begins to participate in the political gathering. It's not just a neutral backdrop, it's something that has a voice, a story to tell of its own. It influences even the outcome of political assembly. This is the only parliament, only permanent parliament that we ever made for the autonomous government of Rojava, which is a Kurdish autonomous region in the northern part of Syria, with whom we worked for many years, since the very beginning of the summit. They invited us to travel to the autonomous region. We worked with local architects and designers to create an open-air parliament, a parliament as a public space, that would represent a political model that has been built on the ground across the last years, that they call stateless democracy. So democracy without the state. Their argument is that in order to liberate the emancipatory potential of democracy, we have to separate it from the state. And that the history of the state, particularly in the Middle East and in the Syrian region, has only been a history of forced separation and violent nationalism. So for them, statelessness is not a position, it doesn't describe a position of victimhood or vulnerability, but is actually a precondition for another type of democracy to emerge. Here's the opening of the parliament in 2018. So this is what I wanted to share this example with you, because I hope it shows this something of what I meant to describe with this organizational turn, to move from the model of closed society represented by her prison model, for me in this case, to attempts, I'm not saying that they are successful, but attempts to think of infrastructures that would allow for another model of open radical democracy to manifest, a counter structure to the closed society of the far right. Now, from the artwork as parliament, I want to move to another example, the artwork as lawsuit. And that's in a way a moment that it came as a very late realization that many years after Wilders prosecuted me in court, that I realized, oh, I could actually also prosecute my opponents in court. Like, why am I only the one who's on the other side of the of the indictment, so to say? So in 2020, I worked together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon to launch what we call a collective action lawsuit. It's called Collectivize Facebook, and it consists of an indictment against Facebook, which now is rebranded as Meta. We know it's still Facebook, so we call it Facebook. So we worked on an indictment against Facebook that we're going to submit at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, in which we make the claim that Facebook, the corporation, infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. So one argument in our indictment is that Facebook as a corporation instrumentalizes users as a kind of neo-feudal data workers. So if you are registered as a Facebook user, you are working for Facebook. You produce data. This data is mined by the company, is sold to third parties like advertisements, like corporations, advertisement agency, used for targeted advertisements. It's used to create consumer profiles that are sold on the market. So you're working for Facebook, but you're not paid by Facebook. It's a theft of labor. It's an illegal extraction of labor time. Of course, that's only one aspect of the way that Facebook infringes on fundamental rights as they are articulated in the UN Charter. We can think about the use of racist algorithms, the use of Facebook in various surveillance capacities, disproportionate impact on democratic elections through companies like Cambridge Analytica, the implication of Facebook in various genocidal campaigns like in Myanmar, and also direct advising to authoritarian regimes such as the previous government of Duterte in the Philippines, to name an example. So what we're saying, what Jan Vermon and me are saying in our indictment is that the very structure of ownership of Facebook is what undermines individual and collective right to self-determination. And that means that Facebook, we claim, we propose, we demand in the indictment, that Facebook is to be recognized as a public domain, as something that has been collectively worked for, collectively created, and that its ownership has to be transferred to its 3 billion users. So we are unpaid data workers, we worked for it, and now we must own it. We have to socialize so-called social media. And that does not mean to reform Facebook. We don't want to nationalize Facebook. We don't want Facebook to become controlled by national governments. We think that's probably even worse than under corporate control. And what we want is to turn trillion-dollar companies like Facebook into a kind of transnational cooperatives. So cooperatively owned, cooperatively governed by their 3 billion users. A way to create a potential pathway beyond the corporation and beyond the state, very much in line with this vision of stateless democracy that I just mentioned in relationship to the work of the New World Summit. Now, of course, this collective action lawsuit is a direct response to the way that public infrastructures, public investment have been structurally extracted into trillion-dollar companies. So data workers, they made Facebook, just as data workers make the Google search engine, huge source of data capital. But also Amazon as a service, as a company, it would be nothing without the publicly funded postal system, which has carried the brunt of its transport, let alone the fact that Amazon doesn't pay social security to its so-called self-employed workers, which means that in the end it's the state that pays social security for its workers. So we're funding, like we are funding Amazon. If you think of Monsanto, who has that is now owned by Bayer, that has stolen knowledge of farmers and indigenous people about seed and seed practices over decades. Like all of that knowledge existed. They patented it, they extracted it. What I mean to say is that the myth of trillion-dollar companies is something that emerges from some kind of CEO brilliance and vision and daring entrepreneurism is really profoundly not true. We have paid for all of them, all of Apple technologies based on publicly funded university research. Nothing that they funded themselves initially. So these companies were always ours. Like they were always collective property. There is no contradiction in claiming that we want to turn them into cooperatives. That's what they should have been in the first place. So since 2020, Jan and me, we organized various, we call it pre-trials, preliminary tribunals. We transform theaters and art spaces into these preliminary tribunals to introduce our indictment against Facebook, to invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses, data activists, other lawyers to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. So they're not witnesses that come to reaffirm that our argumentation or referred precedent is correct. We ask them, witness the future that would become possible if we would win the case against Facebook. Because let's say that we would win. What would be the decision-making structure for 3 billion co-owners of Facebook? Do we ban advertisements? Do we ensure encryption? Do we decentralize servers? Do we dismantle its infrastructure due to its disproportionate environmental impact? Like, what would be the social contract of collectivized Facebook? And of course, I'm a propaganda researcher. I'm also a little bit of a propagandist. If any of you who are hearing this argumentation would want to support us, on collectivized.org you can find the full indictment against Facebook. It's also the place where you can sign, so that today you would leave the room as a co-claimant in the case. So when we file at the UN, we do so not as Jan Vermon and me, we do it with the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who have supported the case. It's a collective case against Facebook for the collectivization of Facebook. Of course, for such efforts to succeed, it's really essential that art and cultural practice is also tied to larger popular mass movements. As an artist, I'm involved with the Make Amazon Pay campaign. I developed the visual campaign identity and some of its visual campaign strategies, mainly when it relates to public space interventions. Since November 27, 2020, we have launched the campaign together with Uni Global Union and Progressive International on Black Friday. So it's the day of this kind of like it's a typical American phenomenon, Black Friday. So it's like a day where you get discounts on everything and a kind of mass buying action. And that's the day we organize collective strikes of Amazon workers across the world. In 2020, it was strikes, demonstrations, projections at Amazon warehouses in India, Bangladesh, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, in Europe, in the United States, including at Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, his own mansion. So it's always good to remind them that we know where they live. And every year on Black Friday, we relaunch the campaign again. So we're trying to continuously build this coalition, which is complex because Amazon forbids the right to unionize, which of course includes the right to unionize protests. So we try to find legal ways to bypass that. The visual morphology, the visual identity of the campaign, it consists of this doubling of the Amazon icon. Of course, in the normal Amazon logo, it is this very cynical smile. In our case, we add the return arrow. So placed on the red canvas, it demands the return of rights to Amazon worker, the return of their labor through a fair income, social security, the right to unionize, the return of environmental costs of carbon excess by Amazon, the return of profits made through tax avoidance by Amazon. So hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity, it's a first attempt to imagine its replacement. The replacement of Amazon as a collectivized Amazon owned and governed by its workers and its users in length of the collectivized Facebook campaign. The reason why I thought it was important to share this is that most of my work is either part of or operates in parallel to these type of organized campaigns and social movements, because I think that's the only way that artistic imagination has a role to play in the political field. If it's only us isolated trying to reimagine the world without trying to link that imagination to people who are actually fighting for that world, then it's impossible to realize it. And then imagination can become something very toxic. Like you imagine the future, you continue to create possible worlds, but if you never realize them, then they become really toxic worlds, because then it becomes an endless reminder of that what is not there, instead of something that could be there. And last example that I want to share with you is the artwork from the artwork as lawsuit, that's collectivized Facebook, to the artwork as court. And that relates to the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. It's a long title. Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, in short, it's the CICC, not the same as the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but of course we are aware of its close proximity. And the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes I co-founded with a lawyer, academic, writer, activist, Rada de Souza. And what we try to do with our court, with the CICC, is to confront a fundamental absence in existing legal institutions. And that is the category of the future. So courts can prosecute the present, as in can prosecute people, states, organizations in the present based on evidence of the past, but courts cannot prosecute states, corporations, individuals in the present for the violence that is done upon unborn humans, unborn animals, unborn plants of the future. So transnational corporations, think Unilever, ING, Airbus, with the complicity of states, they can store their crimes in the future. They can store their crimes in time, because the future has no rights. The future doesn't exist in legislation. Ecocide, that what is the inevitable consequence of fossil capitalism, cannot be prosecuted because the unborn have not yet died, and they are without rights in our existing legal framework. So the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act, of which you see the first page here, that was written by Rada de Souza, my collaborator. It forms the legal foundation of the CICC, and we call through this legal framework for redefinition of time in the context of climate justice struggle. So past, present, and future have to be radically equal. Like the future has to bear equal rights to the present and the past. Ancestors of the future, that's us, we are the ancestors of the future, and future ancestors, those who will become ancestors after us, must be recognized as fundamentally equal. And this is also the legal framework that we use, that we applied in the 4 public hearings that we organized so far, in which we brought together judges, public prosecutors, witnesses, in which we prosecuted representatives of the Dutch state, as well as Dutch registered multinationals. The public acted as the jury, so they have the responsibility to make the final judgment based on this Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. Now, to say something about the form of the court, I realize I very quickly tend to go into the politics of the project, but also to say something about the visual form of the court. The visual form itself consists of evidence of intergenerational climate crime. So the court is populated by images of extinct animals, extinct plants, as well as ammonite fossils. That's the large fossil you see there in the center of the court. That's this one. And ammonites, for those of you who don't know, were a family of octopus and squid. They lived between 300 and 66 million years ago. And they perished in the 5th mass extinction, that's 66 million years ago. And obviously, encountering an ammonite, these fossils, these are about 100 million years old, it might seem that human life and ammonite life are pretty different in terms of our lived time and our organic composition, and well, in every possible way, I guess. But if you think about it, the ammonites are witnesses of the 5th mass extinction. We are witnesses of the 6th mass extinction. They are fossils, but then we are fossils in the making. The ammonite is also literally the fossil inside fossil fuel, which is why we placed it in this pool of refined oil in the center of the quartz, because when we talk about oil, about fossil fuels, we literally talk about fossils. We talk about millions of years of aggregated, decomposed bodies of animals, of plants, that perversely we are burned by fossil capitalism to accelerate mobility in the present, to accelerate our movements, but with this acceleration of movement is also simultaneously the undoing of the possibility of a livable future. So placed in the center of the quartz, you could say this is a kind of maddening chrono-political arena, like an arena in which two politics of time confront themselves. Millions of years of Earth memory and their industrial burning at the same time. So surrounding the center of the quartz, there are paintings depicting extinct animals placed on a radiant yellow background, each of them called Comrade. And each of them is called Comrade in a different, sometimes near extinct language. It also shows that there is an inherent relationship between the extinction of species, of animal species, plant species, and the extinction of human cultures that thrived with these species. And in between them, woven banners of extinct plants are present, equally termed Comrade. And if you look a bit closer into the woven banners of the plants, you can see that their outer shapes are kind of maintained by these banners, these little banners and wires. And these are traces of attempts by scientists to maintain the ghostly shape of these massacred ecosystem workers. So these are images that come directly from the archives, that we studied in the archives, and they have all these band-aids, these protheses, in an attempt to maintain the shape of something that was lost. But of course, these were not just lost by accident, they are lost because the very notion of colonial discovery, the discovery of new plants, new animals, new peoples, this so-called discovery is not a discovery, it's an erasure. The way that these plants and these animals were made to be known is the reason why they don't exist anymore. Like the way that they were discovered is the reason for their disappearance. Nothing was discovered. And that shows something of what I would describe it as a colonial deaf form. It cannot know anything. It cannot discover anything because it cannot know. It can only own. And this form of ownership, this turning of living worlds into property, equals its death. That equals the death of these same living worlds. So honoring non-human ecosystems, honoring non-human ecosystem workers, earth workers, whether they are human or non-human in nature, this is a very important political recognition for us in the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. It emphasizes interdependent struggle against a very reductive idea of rights that dominate our present legal institutions. To give you an example, if we follow this logic of comradeship as a foundation for another paradigm of climate justice, if you harm Comrade River, then you harm all comrades, animals, plants, humans, that live in interdependency with that river. It also means you harm all unborn comrades, all unborn animals, plants, humans, that would have lived with the river in the future had the river not been harmed now. So taking that into account, how could you ever say that rights are individual, that rights can ever be only human or only animal? The reality of our struggle as ecosystem workers, as earth workers, is that our collective self-determination fundamentally relies on one another. The moment that we isolate and we say that's the right of the river and that's the right of the animal or the human that lives with the river, that goes fundamentally counter to the reality of interdependency and the reality of intergenerationality, thinking of those who would live with our fellow comrades in the future. So we are comrades across the human and the non-human world, because we are part of an existential struggle between our defense of living worlds, past, present, and future, against the fossil capitalist death form. And lately, We have been extending the different work that we're doing with the court. We're currently preparing cases in Seoul and in Gwangju, as well as in London. But we also organize different public manifestations in which we try to make the evidence of the courts visible in different ways. So all of the images of extinct plants and animals that we've shown you so far, they are all animals and plants that were made extinct, didn't went extinct, they were made extinct, from the colonial period to the present. It's evidence that climate crimes, that climate catastrophe is 500 years old. It's not 200 years old, it's not since the Industrial Revolution. The first wave of mass extinction begins with colonization. So we try to make public this evidence in various ways. This was a musical procession that we organized in Helsinki, in which the names of each of the extinct non-human comrades, non-human ancestors, was chanted alongside fragments of the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act, so the legal foundation that I mentioned earlier. Of course, the form of the court is only one form to assemble people, and I mean, we organize 8-hour court sessions, listening to witnesses, going through evidentiary materials that doesn't speak to all people, but the evidence that we make public is something that we also want to exist in a broader public domain, which is why we also think of these other public rituals and forms in which we can make people witness to the climate crimes that we try to prosecute, but also in which we can begin to repair the bonds with our human and non-human ancestors and those future ancestors in the making. So I hope that all these examples have given you some sense of what I meant with organizational art practice, or the creation of artworks in the form of organizations, how some of the key crises I mentioned in the beginning, the rise of authoritarianism, global precarization, climate catastrophe, how they influence and shape the propositions of these artworks. The artwork as stateless parliament, as collective action lawsuit, as intergenerational climate court, not just as interventions in dominant systems, the way that they currently exist, but as a way of trying to imagining organization anew. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, and I'm really happy to have a conversation if you're up for it.